The wind carried the sharp tang of dust and fear across the small clearing, rustling the dry grass as Clara pressed herself against the rough bark of a mesquite tree. Her chest heaved, every breath shallow and trembling. Around her, men and women from the settlement clustered in anxious murmurs, hands gripping rifles that did little to mask their uncertainty. Their eyes darted nervously toward the tree line, where the Apache warriors had gathered like shadows of inevitability, their painted faces and feathered headdresses catching the dying light. Clara's gaze fell to the man at the center of the group, a striking figure of calm authority, his dark eyes sharp as obsidian. Talon, the Apache leader, watched her with a studied intensity that sent a cold shiver down her spine. She had heard the whispers of his reputation, ruthless when angered, clever beyond imagining, yet capable of a fierce protective loyalty to those he deemed worthy. And now he was looking at her. A sudden movement from the crowd made her flinch, but Talon's hand shot forward, a silent warning to stay still. His lips parted, and in a voice low and intimate, barely audible over the soft wind, he whispered, "Pretend you're my wife in front of them." Clara froze, the words lodging in her chest like splinters of ice. Her mind screamed against the absurdity, the danger of it. Pretend? His words broke something inside her, a fragile shield she had built against the world after losing her husband months before. She had been cautious, hardened by grief and the constant reminders of mortality in this lawless land. Yet in that whispered command, there was both threat and promise, coercion and a strange, seductive tenderness. Her body betrayed her, trembling in ways her mind could not justify. The murmurs from the settlers grew louder as they noticed the motion between them, though none could hear what was said. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Pretending she was the wife of an Apache leader, a man they all feared, was madness. But the sharp edge of his gaze left her no choice. Survival demanded it, and beneath the pragmatic necessity, she felt a shiver of something unnameable. Talon stepped closer, his presence enveloping her in a silent, unspoken power. He reached out a hand, not harshly but with a firm insistence that she should take it. Clara's fingers hovered for a long moment, suspended between fear and instinct before she reluctantly closed her hand around his. The contact was electric, sending warmth up her arm in defiance of the cold dread clutching her heart. The settlers' voices grew uncertain, some whispering speculations, others openly questioning, but none dared challenge the clear command in Talon's posture. Clara felt the weight of their eyes on her, the judgment, the fear, the suspicion. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to lift her chin, to meet the gaze of the crowd, even as her stomach twisted with humiliation and reluctant adrenaline. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a signal that it had begun. The subtle shift of his expression, softened around the eyes, suggested an intimacy she had not anticipated, a tenderness beneath the formidable exterior. It was enough to make her knees weaken and her breath hitch. Pretending seemed impossible, yet she had no choice but to step forward into the role he demanded, to move as if she belonged to him, though every fiber of her being screamed against it. In the eyes of the settlers, she was now his wife. And in the quiet between heartbeats, in the subtle brush of his hand against hers, she realized something dangerous. The act of pretending was already piercing through the careful walls around her heart. Fear and desire, uncertainty and yearning, tangled together in a storm she could not control. As Talon led her in front of the onlookers, Clara felt a dizzying mix of emotions, humiliation, terror, and a raw, unexpected vulnerability. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of grief and self-preservation, a spark had been lit. The whispered words, so simple yet so shattering, had broken her carefully guarded world. The clearing felt smaller now, every pair of eyes on them like tiny daggers. Clara's fingers remained entwined with Talon's, his grip steady and reassuring, though his touch sent a shiver up her spine she could not explain. Her chest tightened as she followed his lead, each step forward echoing in her ears like the drumbeat of her own anxiety. The settlers were watching. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, half fear, half disbelief. Some exchanged worried glances, others whispered questions about loyalty, alliances, and the audacity of this display. And all the while Clara's mind screamed, "I am not his wife. I do not belong here. This is a lie." Yet the lie was her shield, her lifeline. Talon held his head high, a commanding figure of authority. His eyes scanned the crowd, daring anyone to challenge the scenario he had orchestrated. Then with a subtle motion he guided Clara closer, placing her hand on his chest in a gesture both possessive and protective. The warmth of his body pressed against her side, grounding her even as panic threatened to overwhelm. "Do it," he whispered, a hint of steel beneath the softness. "Pretend." Clara swallowed, her throat dry, and lifted her eyes to meet the onlooker's gaze. She straightened her spine, forcing herself to meet their scrutiny with a calm she did not feel. Every muscle in her body trembled as she leaned slightly into him, mimicking the intimacy of a real married couple. Her pulse raced not only from fear but from the electricity she could not name, the closeness, the deliberate warmth of Talon's presence, the undeniable weight of his hand on hers. A man from the settlement stepped forward, his voice trembling with suspicion. "Is she really yours?" Talon's gaze cut across the man like a blade. "She is mine," he said simply, the words carrying an authority that silenced the questioner instantly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The power behind the statement, the certainty, left no room for argument. Clara felt her stomach knot, both from the audacity of his claim and the strange, protective pride it stirred in her chest. The settlers' reactions were mixed. Some recoiled, others whispered to one another, and a few stared openly, uncertainty and fear dancing across their faces. Clara's mind whirled. She hated the deception, hated the performance, and yet she could not deny the thrill of the intimacy, even if it was staged. Every brush of Talon's fingers, every subtle movement of his body against hers, made her heart race in ways she hadn't felt since her husband's death. Time stretched, each second a torment and a revelation. She caught glimpses of Talon's expression, his calm, commanding gaze softened in ways no one else could see. There was something unspoken between them, a silent acknowledgement that this charade was more than mere survival for her. It was beginning to crack something in both of them. Finally, Talon leaned slightly toward her, lips brushing her ear just enough for his words to linger. "Hold your stance. Trust me." Clara nodded almost imperceptibly, grounding herself in his confidence. The tension in her body eased slightly, replaced by a strange mix of awe and fear. She followed his lead, moving as if she belonged at his side, though every heartbeat screamed otherwise. Yet with each step, each glance, each whispered reassurance, she felt a dangerous warmth spreading through her, a connection she could neither explain nor resist. By the time the crowd's attention began to drift elsewhere, Clara realized her world had shifted. The act of pretending, meant only for survival, had already begun to blur the lines between reality and performance. Fear and fascination tangled inside her, leaving her both terrified and inexplicably drawn to the man beside her. As Talon guided her back toward the edge of the clearing, her mind replayed the whispered words that had started it all. "Pretend you're my wife" in front of them. The thought, once bitter, now carried a different weight. A weight that pressed against her chest, uneasy, electrifying, and entirely irreversibly unforgettable. The forest's edge was a sanctuary of shade and silence after the oppressive glare of the clearing. Talon moved with a quiet authority, every step measured, his presence a steadying anchor for Clara, who still trembled from the performance she had just enacted. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees, and the sounds of the settlers faded behind them. The tension that had coiled tight in her chest began to loosen, though a lingering edge of fear remained. Talon glanced at her, his dark eyes assessing not with suspicion, but with a careful attentiveness that made her heart stutter. "Stay close," he instructed softly, his voice carrying the same intimacy as before. "No one can touch you here." Clara nodded, though her mind was a jumble of conflicting emotions. Relief warred with distrust, gratitude warred with unease, and beneath it all a whisper of something far more dangerous. Curiosity. She had seen the cold command in Talon's eyes, the lethal precision in his movements, and yet now she noticed subtle shifts, the way he adjusted his pace for her, the brief flash of gentleness when he helped her navigate a tricky root or low-hanging branch. It was unexpected, and it unsettled her more than any threat ever could. As they walked deeper into the forest, the landscape changed. The harsh open plains gave way to groves of mesquite and juniper, where sunlight dappled the ground in shifting patterns. Clara felt a strange sense of safety here, though she knew instinctively that Talon could traverse this land with ease, while she was merely a visitor in a world foreign and potentially hostile. Yet every time he offered his hand, or brushed aside a branch in her path, She felt a flutter of something she couldn't name, a mixture of admiration, gratitude, and something closer to longing. Finally, they reached the Apache camp, tucked into a hidden valley beyond the rise of a low hill. Smoke curled lazily from several small fires, and the rhythmic sounds of daily life, laughter, conversation, the clang of tools, filled the air. Clara's breath caught at the sight. The camp was orderly, thriving, alive with a vibrancy that defied the grim tales she had heard from settlers. Here, Talon was not the fearsome figure from the clearing. He was a leader among his people, respected and understood in a way that was both humbling and awe-inspiring. He guided her toward a small structure at the camp's edge, offering her a seat and gesturing for her to rest. Clara hesitated, feeling the awkward vulnerability of being both a guest and a captive, but Talon's presence was grounding. He knelt beside her, gathering a handful of water from a nearby container and handing it to her. "Drink," he said simply. "You need strength." The gesture, small as it was, struck her unexpectedly. It was not condescending, not patronizing, it was caring, deliberate, protective. She drank, her hands shaking slightly, and for the first time since the clearing she felt a flicker of peace. Talon watched her closely, as if gauging her reactions, then spoke, almost casually. "You don't need to pretend here." "Not with me." Clara's throat tightened. Those words, simple yet profound, carried an intimacy that left her both disarmed and unsettled. In that moment she saw a crack in the formidable armor he wore so well in front of the settlers. She realized that the Talon she had feared, the one who demanded she pretend to be his wife, was only one facet of him. Beneath it lay a man capable of careful thought, unexpected gentleness, and even a glimmer of vulnerability he did not reveal to the world. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to probe the strange mixture of fear and attraction that churned inside her. But the words lodged stubbornly in her throat. Instead, she simply met his gaze, and in the unspoken language between them she understood. Here, in the quiet of the camp, she was more than a pawn. She was seen, and in that recognition, Clara felt the first stirrings of trust, a fragile, trembling trust, yet more powerful than she could have anticipated. Night fell gently over the camp, draping the valley in a soft, star-strewn darkness. The fires burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced across the faces of the Apache, their laughter and quiet conversation weaving a comforting rhythm through the evening air. Clara sat close to one of the smaller fires, her fingers wrapped around a cup of warm water, trying to steady the rapid beat of her heart. The events of the day, the public display, Talon's whispered command, the trek through the forest, still churned inside her, a mix of fear, shame, and an odd, unsettling curiosity. Talon settled beside her, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, softening the intensity of his dark eyes. He did not speak at first, simply observing her with a measured patience that was almost hypnotic. Clara felt both exposed and safe under his gaze, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly even as her mind remained wary. "Do you want to know about us?" he asked finally, his voice quiet yet resonant in the intimate space of their small circle. His question caught her off guard. She hesitated, uncertain how to respond, but the sincerity in his tone was disarming. Clara nodded. I want to understand," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I've heard. It's never matched what I've seen today." Talon's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly, and he gestured toward the fire. "Then listen," he said simply. He began to speak of his people, their history, their code of honor, and the traditions that guided every action, from hunting to warfare, from leadership to family. He described a world that was structured, deeply moral, and fiercely protective of its own. Clara listened, captivated, the words drawing her into a world she had never known, a world that was both alien and profoundly compelling. As he spoke, he did not lecture or boast. He shared. There was a cadence to his speech, a rhythm that made her lean closer, hungry for the knowledge and understanding he offered. She noticed the care in his movements, the way he handled the fire, the way he ensured her cup was filled, the way his eyes never left her face when he wanted to emphasize a point. These small acts of attentiveness were grounding, and Clara felt a strange mixture of relief and attraction she could not yet name. When he paused, she dared a question. Do you ever feel fear?" Her voice trembled slightly. Talon's expression darkened, a shadow crossing his features. Fear is part of life, he admitted, his tone softening. It shapes us, teaches us what we must protect. But it is not weakness. We face it. Always. His gaze held hers, unwavering, and for a moment, Clara glimpsed a side of him few had ever seen. A man bound by courage, yet profoundly human. The night deepened, and they spoke long into the darkness. Talon shared stories of battles and losses, of victories and quiet moments of joy. He spoke of his responsibilities, the weight of leadership, and the rare moments when he allowed himself to hope for something more than survival. Clara, in turn, shared fragments of her own life, careful not to betray too much vulnerability but unable to resist the pull of this rare intimacy. Each revelation was a thread, weaving a fragile bond between them, a trust built in the flickering firelight. By the time the fire dwindled to embers, Clara felt the first true sense of connection. The fear that had dominated her since the clearing was tempered by understanding, by the realization that Talon was not just a formidable leader, he was a man capable of thoughtfulness, of care, of unexpected gentleness. And in that quiet, shared space, Clara sensed the beginnings of something deeper. The walls she had built around her heart, thick with grief and caution, were starting to shift, stirred by the intimacy of shared stories and the soft cadence of his voice. For the first time since the day had begun, she allowed herself to hope, not just for safety but for the possibility of trust, perhaps even of something more. The dawn came quietly, spilling pale light across the valley and brushing the tops of the camp with a gentle glow. Clara stirred from a restless sleep, the memories of the previous night, the whispered words, the firelit conversations, the strange intimacy she had felt, still clinging to her like a second skin. She stepped outside the small structure where she had been given shelter, hoping for a moment of solitude, a chance to gather her scattered thoughts. The camp was waking. Smoke curled from the fires, and the soft murmur of voices, laughter, and footsteps created a comforting rhythm. Clara wandered toward the edge of the camp, her eyes catching on Talon, who was already moving with purposeful grace. He carried himself with that same air of authority that had first unsettled her. Yet there was something different now, a looseness in his posture, a quiet focus that was not meant for anyone but himself. Curiosity nudged her closer, and she slowed her steps, careful to remain unseen. She watched as Talon approached a small, worn drum, its surface cracked from years of use. He set it on the ground, knelt, and began to carefully repair it, his fingers deft and precise. There was a softness in the way he handled the instrument, a tenderness she had never seen in the clearing or even around the campfires. It was a side of him entirely hidden from the world, a private devotion to something meaningful, fragile, and personal. Clara's chest tightened. She realized with startling clarity that the man she had feared, the leader who had demanded she pretend to be his wife, was more than the mask he showed the world. He was capable of gentleness, of care, of small acts of devotion that revealed a depth she hadn't expected. For a moment she dared to imagine what it might feel like to truly know him, beyond the boundaries of pretense and survival. Talon paused, his hands resting lightly on the drum. He closed his eyes, taking a slow, deliberate breath as though centering himself in a moment of rare quiet. Clara felt a pang of empathy. He bore burdens unseen by anyone else, and yet he carried them with a quiet strength. It was intimate, even sacred, and she realized she had never truly seen anyone like this before. Her walls, built from grief and fear, shivered under the weight of her fascination. She stepped back silently, unwilling to disturb the moment, but unable to turn away. The vulnerability, the unguarded humanity was magnetic. Clara felt the stirrings of emotions she had long suppressed, admiration, compassion, and something dangerously akin to longing. It was no longer just fear keeping her close to Talon. It was the recognition of the man beneath the warrior's exterior. A sudden sound, one of the younger warriors calling from the other side of the camp, pulled Talon back to the present. He glanced toward the noise, then caught sight of Clara's fleeting shadow. A small knowing smile curved his lips, fleeting but potent. "You watch too closely," he said softly, though there was no rebuke in his tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. Clara's cheeks flushed and she turned away, though her mind remained with him. The moment lingered, a fragile bridge between them that had been built without words, without gestures intended for anyone else. It was private, intimate, and it left her both unsettled and exhilarated. For the first time, she understood that the pretend marriage in the clearing had been only the beginning. The real story, the truth of Talon and perhaps the truth of herself, was unfolding in these quiet moments of vulnerability and trust. And the realization struck her with both awe and fear. The walls around her heart were beginning to crumble, and there was no guarantee she could control what came next. The morning air was tense, heavy with the scent of smoke and sun-baked earth. Clara had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the camp, yet today brought a dissonance she could feel deep in her bones. A scout had returned, breathless and wide-eyed, warning that a group of settlers, armed and angry, was approaching the valley. Their intentions were unclear, but the threat was real. Fear rippled through the Apache warriors, a silent undercurrent beneath their disciplined movements. Talon moved with swift authority, issuing concise commands that sent warriors to strategic positions around the camp. Clara watched him, awed by the seamless precision of his leadership. Yet in the quiet moments between orders, she noticed the subtle care with which he ensured his people's safety, his gaze lingering on each individual as if their lives were as precious to him as his own. She felt a pang of helplessness, a gnawing sense of inadequacy. Here, in this hidden valley surrounded by people whose skills and strength she could never match, she was vulnerable in ways she had never imagined. And yet, there was a growing determination rising within her. Survival alone would not be enough. Not for her, not if Talon and these people were in danger. A sudden thought struck her. I can help. She approached Talon cautiously, heart pounding. I can help, she said, voice shaking but resolute. I know the camp, the paths. I can warn others or anything you need. Talon's dark eyes flicked to hers, measuring, assessing, searching for doubt. Then, after a tense pause, he gave a small nod. Then stay close. Move quickly. Do not draw attention. But your presence can save lives if you act wisely. His voice, calm yet commanding, bolstered her courage. Clara moved through the camp with a mix of fear and adrenaline, warning workers and guiding them to prepared positions, her knowledge of the terrain proving unexpectedly useful. Every movement was a small victory. Every life she helped protect a silent defiance of the helplessness she had once felt. She felt a strange exhilaration in being useful, in being trusted, in standing beside Talon in the face of danger. When the settlers finally arrived, shouting and brandishing weapons, the Apache warriors met them with precise, coordinated resistance. Clara remained at Talon's side, heart hammering, adrenaline sharpening every sense. The world narrowed to the sound of footsteps, the crackle of fires, the whispered commands between leader and follower. She realized, with both fear and thrill, that she was no longer a passive observer. She was a part of this fight, a participant whose choices mattered. In the heat of the confrontation, Talon glanced at her once, eyes dark and intense, and she understood without words that her courage was recognized, valued, even admired. The line between their pretend marriage and real partnership blurred, their bond cemented in the shared danger, the trust in each other's instincts, and the knowledge that survival depended not on isolation, but on connection. By the time the settlers retreated, beaten back by skill and strategy, Clara's hands were raw, her clothes dust-streaked, and her heart still raced. But beneath the exhaustion and fear, there was a profound sense of accomplishment, and a dangerous thrill that she had never imagined possible. Talon turned to her, expression unreadable at first, then softened. You did well, he said quietly, the words carrying a weight she had never heard before. Your courage, it saved lives. Clara's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and disbelief. She had come to the Apache camp as a frightened, powerless outsider, and now, in the wake of danger, she realized she was valued not just as a survivor, but as someone who had earned trust, respect, and, in some inexplicable way, a place in Talon's world. And in that recognition, a new bond solidified, one forged in fear, trust, and the shared thrill of standing together against a threat far greater than either of them could face alone. The camp had settled into a wary calm after the retreat of the settlers. Fires smoldered low, smoke curling lazily into the evening sky, and the soft sounds of the Apache tending to their wounded or repairing shelters filled the valley. Clara moved among them quietly, her body still humming with adrenaline from the day's events, but her mind restless, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to Talon than he had shown. It was that curiosity, that insistent need to understand him beyond the veneer of strength and authority, that led her to the small, secluded structure he used for private reflection. She hesitated at the threshold, uncertain whether she should intrude, but the soft glow of firelight inside drew her forward. Inside, Talon was bent over a worn leather pouch, carefully removing small items one by one. A feathered talisman, a carved stone, and finally a folded piece of parchment. Clara's breath caught. She had never seen him handle anything with such reverence, and the intimacy of the moment struck her deeply. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if each item carried the weight of memory and meaning far beyond their physical form. Talon noticed her presence, but instead of anger or command, there was a flicker of acknowledgement, a subtle invitation. "These are reminders," he said quietly, voice softer than she had ever heard, "of what I've lost, of who I am." Clara stepped closer, compelled despite herself. "Can I see?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded, extending the parchment. It was a letter faded with age, written in a careful looping script. As she read, her heart ached at the words, a mixture of love, regret, and hope that had never been fulfilled. She saw a side of Talon that no one else did, a man capable of deep emotion, of heartbreak, of longing. The walls around him were formidable, yet here, in the privacy of his own space, they were gone. Talon watched her face closely as she absorbed the words. "Few have seen this," he admitted, his voice low, almost vulnerable. "It is not weakness. It is memory. A reminder that even the strongest are not without pain." Clara's throat tightened. The image of him in the clearing, commanding, untouchable, was replaced by this quiet human presence. Complex, layered, capable of tenderness. She realized how little she truly knew him, and yet how deeply she was beginning to feel for him. Respect, trust, and an unfamiliar longing twisted together in her chest. I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know you carried so much with you." Talon's eyes softened, and for the first time he allowed a small vulnerability to show. "It shapes me," he said simply. "It reminds me of what matters, and who I am willing to protect." His gaze lingered on her, dark and intense, and Clara felt the unspoken words between them, the bond forming, fragile but undeniable. For a long moment, they shared silence, the kind of silence that speaks volumes. Clara understood that trust was being extended to her, and that it came with weight and expectation. She felt honored and terrified all at once. Finally, Talon tucked the items back into the pouch and closed it carefully, as if sealing a part of his soul. He looked at her with that commanding presence softened by vulnerability. "You are learning who I am," he said, almost more to himself than to her. "And yet, you remain," Clara swallowed hard. She realized then that her place in his world was no longer just that of a survivor, a pawn in a staged deception. She had begun to matter to him in ways she had never imagined. And with that, the bond between them deepened, trust entwined with fascination, respect intertwined with the first hints of desire. In the quiet of the fading firelight, Clara knew one thing with certainty. The act of pretending was no longer just a survival tactic. Something real was beginning to bloom, and there was no turning back. Night descended over the valley with a heavy, expectant quiet. The camp was alive with the soft murmurs of warriors and the occasional crackle of embers in the fires, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Talon had sensed it hours before, a small band of rival tribesmen moving silently through the outskirts of the camp, shadows sliding between trees. The thrill of danger, mingled with the intimacy of shared moments earlier, made Clara's pulse race uncontrollably. She was at Talon's side when the alert was sounded, her hand brushing against his as they moved swiftly toward the outer perimeter. Unlike previous encounters, this time the threat was immediate and intimate. Every step, every glance, every subtle command drew them closer together. Her heart pounded, not from fear alone, but from the adrenaline and the electric awareness of his presence beside her. As the first figures emerged from the shadows, Talon reacted with a precision born of years of leadership and combat. Clara followed his movements instinctively, her instincts sharpened by days in the camp. They moved as one, a perfect rhythm of action and reaction, the line between pretend and real disappearing with every heartbeat. During a brief lull, Talon ducked behind a low rise, pulling Clara close. Their faces were inches apart, the heat of the night mingling with the fire of their shared adrenaline. His eyes, dark and intense, searched hers with an urgency that went beyond the immediate danger. "Stay close," he whispered, his breath brushing her ear. "Trust me. Only me." Clara's chest tightened, the intensity of his gaze and the closeness of his body breaking through the careful defenses she had maintained. She felt exposed and utterly vulnerable, yet safe in a way that terrified her more than the threat outside. The lines between fear, trust, and desire blurred. One of the rival warriors lunged forward, and Talon's arm shot out instinctively to protect her, knocking her back just enough to avoid the danger. The motion, the proximity, the sheer force of his protective instinct, it ignited something in Clara she could not deny. Her fear mingled with a rush of emotion she had fought to suppress, a mixture of relief, exhilaration, and longing. As the skirmish subsided and the attackers retreated, Talon kept her close, his hands lingering in ways that were no longer merely protective. The adrenaline still coursing through her veins made every touch electric, every glance charged with unspoken communication. In the quiet aftermath, the camp's fires illuminating their faces, Clara realized that the pretense of the staged marriage had completely dissolved. What remained was raw, urgent, and undeniably real. He leaned in slightly, his lips barely brushing her temple. "You are brave," he said, voice low, roughened by exertion and emotion. "Do you understand? You are not just surviving, you are part of this, part of me." Clara's breath hitched. She could not find words. The fear, admiration, respect, and desire mingled into a single overwhelming sensation. She realized she was no longer pretending, no longer simply following the act he had orchestrated in the clearing. Her heart and body were fully engaged, entwined with his in a connection that was intimate, dangerous, and real. For the first time, she allowed herself to surrender to the moment. Not fully, perhaps, but enough to recognize the depth of what was stirring between them. In the quiet aftermath of danger, amidst the flickering firelight and shadows of the camp, Clara and Talon stood closer than they had ever been, a bond forged in fear, trust, and the undeniable pull of mutual desire. And in that closeness, she knew the next steps, emotionally and physically, would forever blur the line between survival, trust, and love. The valley lay quiet under the pale morning sun, a deceptive calm after the storm of the previous night. Clara sat near the edge of the camp, her fingers tracing the rough edge of a carved stone Talon had shown her days before. Her mind, however, was far from calm. A messenger had arrived from the settlers' town, offering her a safe passage back, a return to the familiar world of rules, safety, and predictability. But the choice tormented her. On one side lay security, a return to a life constrained but known. On the other lay Talon, the Apache camp, and a future brimming with danger, uncertainty, and something far more intoxicating: connection. Her heart ached at the thought of leaving him, of abandoning a bond that had grown from whispered commands and staged performances into something undeniable. Talon approached quietly, sensing the turmoil in her posture, before he spoke. "The choice is yours," he said, his voice low, carrying both gravity and care. "You may leave, and I will not stand in your way." Clara turned to him, her eyes searching his, reading not threat or manipulation, but respect. That respect both comforted and terrified her. To be allowed to choose freely, after everything, was a gift, and it forced her to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She no longer wanted to leave. She began, then faltered. Words felt inadequate to convey the depth of her conflict. Her heart and mind were at war, her body still recalling the intensity of their closeness, the brush of his hand, the strength of his protective presence. "I can go back," she whispered, voice trembling. "I could be safe." Talon shook his head gently, stepping closer, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. "Safe does not mean living," he said softly. "You are alive here, with me, with us. You are not merely surviving, you are part of something real, something worth risking everything for." Her breath caught. She thought of the settlers' town, of the narrow streets and familiar faces, and compared it to the valley, The warmth of the fires, the pulse of the camp, and the undeniable presence of Talon at her side. The pull was magnetic, and she realized with a shock that it was not just survival or loyalty that tethered her to this place. It was desire, trust, and a growing love she had no intention of denying. I don't know if I can go back, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Her confession hung in the morning air like a fragile bird, unsteady but free. Talon's expression softened, a mixture of relief and admiration passing over his features. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering, just long enough to convey the intimacy words could not capture. Then stay, he said simply, his voice steady, his presence unwavering. Stay with me, with us. Your choice has been made. Clara felt a wave of emotion crash over her, relief, fear, exhilaration, and love, all mingling into one powerful certainty. The life she had known, safe but hollow, faded in the face of this living, breathing world that had welcomed her, tested her, and ultimately captured her heart. She stepped closer, closing the gap between them, her hand finding his. The warmth of his touch, the steady strength of his presence grounded her even as her heart raced. She no longer had to pretend, no longer had to guard herself against him or the world. In that moment she chose him, chose the Apache camp, chose a life of danger, passion, and connection that promised to be as unpredictable as it was real. And as Talon's hand tightened around hers, Clara realized that the act of pretending, the staged marriage, the whispered words, the careful performances, had become unnecessary. What remained was raw, real, and enduring. For the first time in her life, she felt fully alive, and fully in love. The sun dipped low over the valley, casting a golden glow across the camp and turning the sky into a canvas of fiery reds and soft purples. Clara stood beside Talon, her fingers intertwined with his, feeling the steady strength of his hand in hers. For weeks the valley had been her refuge, the fires her solace, and Talon, once a figure of fear and mystery, had become the center of her world. The settler's town, the life she had once known, had faded into memory. Here, among the Apache, she was part of something alive, something vibrant, and something entirely her own. The staged act of pretending she was Talon's wife had long since dissolved. What had begun as a survival tactic had transformed into a bond forged through danger, trust, and deep, undeniable love. Around the camp, the Apache moved with purpose and confidence. Children laughed near the fire, warriors trained under the careful watch of their leader, and the small details of daily life, the rhythm of cooking, the sharpening of weapons, the tending of wounds, carried a quiet beauty that Clara had come to cherish. She understood now that this world, so foreign and intimidating at first, had become hers. Talon turned to her, his dark eyes softening as they met hers. Clara, he said, voice low but steady, you chose to stay. You chose this life, and in doing so, you chose me. Clara's heart swelled. She stepped closer, letting herself be held, allowing the warmth of his body and the unspoken promise in his gaze to envelop her. I chose you, she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion. Not for safety, not for survival, but because I cannot imagine my life without you. A small, rare smile curved Talon's lips. Neither can I, he murmured, his hand cupping her cheek gently. The act of pretending is over. What we have, it is real. Clara leaned into him, feeling the solid reassurance of his presence, the fierce protection and tenderness combined into one overwhelming force. The fear and uncertainty that had once defined her world melted away, replaced by the quiet certainty of love, trust, and belonging. They walked together through the camp side by side as the Apache acknowledged them not as a staged couple, but as partners in life, heart, and spirit. Children ran past, laughing and shouting. Warriors nodded with respect, and the elders smiled knowingly. Here Clara was not just accepted, she was embraced. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Talon and Clara stood by the largest fire in the center of the camp. Silence settled around them, warm and comforting, punctuated only by the crackle of embers. Talon's hand found hers once more, their fingers lacing naturally. "You are home," he whispered, a statement and a promise all at once. Clara's chest tightened with emotion. "Yes," she replied softly, her eyes meeting his with unwavering certainty. "I am home. With you." The firelight danced across their faces, highlighting the unspoken devotion, the deep connection, and the love that had grown from the whispered words of a staged pretense into a bond unbreakable. The pretend marriage had become real, and in that transformation, Clara and Talon had found not only survival but joy, passion, and a shared life worth every risk. In the quiet of the Apache camp under the vast expanse of stars, Clara felt an unshakable peace. She was no longer a stranger, no longer merely a survivor. She was a partner, a beloved, a woman who had faced fear and choice, danger and desire, and had come out stronger, braver, and fully in love. And Talon, the formidable warrior who had whispered the words that broke her, held her close, knowing that neither time, nor threat, nor circumstance could undo what they had built together. Their hearts, once separated by fear and uncertainty, now beat as one. In that moment, Clara knew the truth. The life she had never dared to imagine was real, and it was hers.